At 4:47 a.m. on May 11, 1945, before the sun had even begun to claim the hills above Dingalan Bay, a canvas tent flap ripped open and a blade flashed in the pre-dawn gloom. A single brutal cut, too quick for a prayer, sliced the air and nearly tore the right ear from a young soldier's head. He woke with the taste of copper and the world narrowed to one immediate truth. He must not die here. Records from the action show variations in the spelling of the man's name: McKinney, McKenna, McKinn. For clarity, this narration will use McKenna. Titled as 41 in this film's hook, contemporary investigators credited him with 40 confirmed enemy killed during the engagement. The title uses 41 as a narrative legacy figure. Company A, 123rd Infantry Regiment, 33rd Infantry Division, held a small outpost on the headlands above Dingalan Bay, Luzon. The company was exhausted after weeks of patrolling and hard fighting across the Philippine hills. Men slept in tight rows of canvas, their rifles within arm's reach, their breath clouding in the cold before dawn. Japanese forces preferred darkness and silence for night infiltration. They had trained for this. They believed stealth would win them the battle. They were wrong. He was 24 from a stretch of red clay in rural Georgia. The son of sharecroppers, he had grown up on hunting trails and creek banks. He read the shape of animals in tracks and listened to the minor shifts of wind through pines. He learned to be quiet and patient. He learned to hold his breath until the world decided to give him the shot. Those skills were not taught in a classroom. They were bred into him by seasons of hunger and a rifle aimed at a distant moving target. When he enlisted in 1942, the Army taught him formation, discipline, and how to march. The woods taught him something else: the small practical selfishness of survival. He slept near a machine gun emplacement, one of the linchpins of the outpost. That gun, more than a bunker or a trench, controlled the slope and the approach. If it fell, the position could be rolled up like a spool. The gun crew inside the pit were a nucleus, a gunner, an assistant, a few extra bodies to feed ammunition belts. On this morning, the enemy struck with knives and bayonets under a cloak of darkness, moving between sentries like ghosts. The first hand that slipped through the tent had the confidence of someone who had practiced this before. Sergeant Fukutaro Mori moved with that same quiet, lethal precision. He intended to end the sleeping man with minimal noise. He mistimed a step. The tent canvas snagged. The blade did not find clean purchase. It slashed instead, across skin, across cartilage. The man rolled, half awake, bleeding and furious. He did not reach for a prayer. He reached for weight. He swung the butt of his M1 like a club. The butt met flesh and bone. Mori staggered, then collapsed. McKenna did not wait. He heard men moving outside, curses or soft commands in a language he did not understand. He smelled cordite. Somewhere, a weapon had already fired, and the piercing sting of his own wound. The ear hung in a ragged crease of canvas and blood. His head rang, not only with the blow that had come from the blade, but with the sudden animal roar that rose from somewhere deep inside him. Survival had a voice. It was not a polite one. He ran. The machine gun pit lay exposed along a ridgeline not 40 yards from the tents. He burst from the shelter of canvas into a choreography of chaos. Shouts, muffled by distance, figures moving like branches. A light flare blossomed and died to the east. The gun itself was in enemy hands, now being dragged into position. Men clustered. Japanese soldiers were pressing the emplacement, using the element of surprise to orient the gun toward the outpost's flank. When he hit the pit, everything was kinetic. A man with a bandolier of belts clutched the feed tray. Another spat a curse and shoved a clip into the weapon. McKenna hit the pit like a thrown stone. He did not aim. He swung. He struck until a body stopped moving, then struck again. Close enough to smell the enemy's breath and hear their ragged panic, he fought with the blunt items at hand: rifle stocks, fists, anything that would keep the gun from firing on his comrades. He cleared the pit in seconds. 10 men fell in the space of a breath. The gun, though, refused to obey. It chattered once, twice, and locked, jammed at the feed. An enemy hand had fouled the mechanism. A strip of ammunition lay scattered on the ground. He had a single rifle in his hands and a jammed machine gun that could not be coaxed into life with the torrent of enemy pressure bearing down the slope. This was the first stubborn fact of the morning. The weapon that could dominate the valley was silent. The responsibility for that silence became his. He scavenged. Belted ammunition. Empty bags. The weight of rounds on his shoulders calmed him, the way a practiced man finds order in reloads and counts. He tore open pouches, emptied them into his lap. He loaded what he could into his rifle. When an enemy grenade clipped the rim of the pit and bounced harmlessly into a fold of canvas, he seized it and hurled it back before the firing adjustment could come. Improvisation replaced planning. The strict schedules of doctrine dissolved. What remained were breaths, angles, leverage. Minutes slid into a measured, brutal rhythm. 0 to 5 minutes. The tent slash, the hand-to-hand, the rush to the gun pit. He repelled the first, immediate surge. Men who had expected to take an outpost full of sleeping Americans instead hit a wall of will. The sound was a serrated mix, metallic pings as empty clips struck canvas, the crack of a rifle, the dull thud of men hitting earth. His head still sang from the near amputation. Each step caused a wet sting, and the taste of iron in his mouth reminded him to be fast. 15 minutes. They returned with a plan. Mortars began to bracket the approaches, low, thudding impacts that kicked dust and wilting grass into the air. The enemy crept along the low ground, trying to get around the flanks. McKenna moved with them. He did not stay rooted to the pit. He knew the dirt. Shallow depressions, animal trails, the sheltering dip behind a waist-high rise. He slid between them. He fired, then moved. He fired, then shifted again. Every shot was purposeful. He picked angles that minimized exposure. A quick snap from the left side of the pit, a roll to the right where foxholes offered a second of cover, a dart forward to deny a man the chance to steady his aim. He was conserving ammo and measuring heartbeats. He had learned to do both in the woods. Every 9 or 10 rounds were a pledge to remain alive for 10 more seconds. At one point he took cover behind a crate of ammunition, American rations, boxed artillery rounds stacked for transport, stole a grenade from a wounded attacker, and turned it into currency. He lobbed it into a knot of enemy fighters attempting to crawl into the gun's arc. The blast disrupted their alignment. He surged, shoulder first into the chaos, and closed distance to prevent the gun from being recaptured. All the while, mortar corrections tightened. The enemy adjusted to his movement. Fragments began to pepper the ground, and the shock of each impact made his teeth clench. He could feel the small, ignorant pain of wind-borne grit against his face. He could feel, more tellingly, the small betrayals of his own body. Breath that came too rapid, hands that trembled on an exhale, a pulsing in the ear that had been nicked. He was not alone in fighting. Other defenders hustled between firing points, thrown into sudden purpose by the alarm of the attack. One man, the machine gunner, wounded in the opening assault and later identified as Private James Hendricks, stood with an open wound and a rifle, trading positions with McKenna when the latter needed to rest a cramped shoulder. But records from the engagement make a clear axis. The concentrated pattern of enemy dead clustered where McKenna held the slope. Investigators later attributed 40 confirmed kills to his actions in the engagement. The figures would be debated and parsed on paper. In the raw morning light, the work was simply to keep firing until bullets, face, lungs, or orders told him to stop. He mixed tactics easily. When a flanking column tried to crawl through a groove in the terrain, he did not wait to be sighted. He ran an exposed 20 yards to cut off their approach, fired into their center of gravity, and let the weight of his aggression force them to break and scatter. When an enemy tried to set up a light automatic weapon behind a low berm, he crawled toward its support team, seized the feed tray of one man, and banged it against a rock until the small mechanism would not feed. He understood that disabling a weapon was as good as killing the men manning it. His ammunition ran low. The machine gun remained silent. The enemy pressed in waves, first probing, then more organized. They used kneeling stances, rolling approaches, and the particular ruthless logic of an assault. Get in close and deny the defender's room to swing a rifle. McKenna answered with a combination of fire and movement. He used the dead and wounded as temporary barricades, pushed a fallen stretcher into a firing lane, and, if necessary, emptied his rifle and scavenged another from a man who would not be getting up again. There was no time for reflection. There was time only for the small arithmetic of survival. Rounds remaining, distance to cover, angle of approach. Every decision was tactical, immediate. Kill or be killed. Hold, or the line opens. The sounds of war in that window were elemental. A metallic ping, an empty clip snapping against the rim of a canteen, the thud of boots, the hollow, stubborn beat of his heart, the whisper of canvas in disturbed tents. The nearer the fighting pushed to the company's center, the thicker the dust and cordite became. The smell of burned powder dissolved the cold dawn into a raw chemical dawn. At about the 12-minute mark, he found himself facing an enemy officer who had tried to rush the pit with a pistol tucked into his belt. The man was at close quarters, braced to push into the position, when a grenade broke his momentum. McKenna blasted him at point-blank range. There was no time for thoughts of valor. There was only the clean, terrible pathway of action. Between enemy advances, there were tiny charged seconds where the world offered a false lull. He would look up and see the ridgeline, the small silhouette of a comrade firing from another emplaced position, the slow, pale sweep of dawn trying to make sense of the chaos. In those seconds, he felt the heavy weight of his wound, blood matting his hair and running cold down the side of his face. He felt the searing, insistent ringing in his ear. He tasted metal. Still, he kept moving. At the edge of that first quarter hour, one man, wounded and shaking, shifted into a depression to his left. He was shaking not only from the cold and pain, but from the effort of holding himself upright. McKenna insisted he pass over a strip of belts he'd collected. "Take them," he said, in a voice that sounded like someone else's. The man took the rounds. The small human exchange was nothing at all and everything at once, a transfer of life in the form of leaded metal. The enemy tried to learn his pattern. They attempted to bait him. A small team fanned right, hoping to draw him into a momentary exposure so that others could set the gun. He did not oblige. He let them extend, then he struck the hinge of the formation. He used instinct more than training. He put his weight where it would interrupt their geometry. He understood with animal clarity that angles matter more than numbers when the ground folds in your favor. He improvised traps too. At one point he set an enemy rifle over a low berm and angled his fire so that a would-be flanker would be forced to run the exposed ground to avoid that weapon. When the man went, McKenna was waiting with a short, compressed burst that sent him down. The technique was simple battlefield mathematics. Control the avenue of approach and force the attacker to choose between two bad options. If one of those options could be sterilized, the rest fell apart. The morning stretched. 5 minutes felt like an hour. The cadence of fighting established itself in his bones, short, deliberate bursts of fire, quick movements to cover, frantic grabs for the next useful piece of equipment. A pivot when a new threat presented itself. Men fell, men scrambled to fill their slack. At times he was a single point of concentrated resistance, at others, a small fulcrum inside a larger, fraying structure of defense. As the offensive continued, two realities became unquestionable. First, the enemy were determined and had been trained for infiltration. Second, McKenna's presence had become a pivot. Where he defended, the attack stalled. Where he struck, the enemy recoiled. That calculus would later show up on investigators' maps, clusters of dead where his defense had been most intense. But in the moment, there was no record, only the raw ledger of breaths and lead. Around the 20-minute mark, accuracy began to decline. Not because targets were farther, or because weapons failed, but because fingers and eyes betrayed exhaustion. His shoulder ached from the repeated motion of loading and firing. His hands, slick with sweat and blood, found magazine lips harder to grip. He started to count silently, not by minutes, but by the sets of 10 rounds he fired, and the pause between them used to reload or reposition. The pause was a heartbeat and a risk. Through all of this, command remained distant. The company's rear echelons tried to reconstitute a reaction force, but the approach from the reserve was slow in the terrain and under sporadic fire. Radio communications, when available, were unreliable. Orders filtered like slow rain. For long stretches, the men on that ridge were on their own. The enemy adapted. Mortar corrections became more accurate. A light automatic weapon found a new angle and began to sweep a lane he had previously used for movement. He changed. He crawled through narrower confines, hugged slopes so steep his knees burned, used the sun's rising glare to obscure his silhouette when possible. He fed himself by snatching small bites of ration chocolate and gulping from a canteen that tasted faintly of the soldier who had used it before him. For a moment, in a breath between volleys, he allowed himself to imagine what his mother would think if she could see him now. The thought was sharp and useless. Then, the next wave. They came in more organized this time. Columns built to exploit a breach, teams with grenades and close assault tactics. It was a sustained push that lasted several minutes, and it required a kind of raw, concentrated brutality to meet. He stole a burst, charged, and threw himself into the fray to prevent a team from setting up another weapon beside the main pit. Around him, men screamed in languages he did not understand. The world distilled to the physical operations of kill and hold. His M1 bit and spat. He drained one magazine and had to pry open the feed of another rifle seized from a dead man. Fingers numb, he learned to clear jams with the heel of his hand, to wedge rounds in with a pocket knife when necessary. He used the discarded belts of enemy ammunition as quick repairs, feeding them into pockets, stuffing them into pouches to have at hand when his own supplies dwindled. A minute-by-minute chronicle of the morning would later show spikes of intensity clustered around his position. It would show the ebb and flow of pressure, the attackers surging forward, then hesitating, then attempting to re-coordinate. It would mark the times when he took a step forward into danger to deny the enemy the comfort of reorganizing their assault. From the ground, those 40 or so minutes were a continuous unspooling of similar choices. Move, fire, scrape for supply, bind the wound enough to keep functioning. At the end of the first 20 minutes, he realized how much of his body had become time. Limbs moved according to a logic drilled into him by training and lived experience. His left hand found the rifle's forearm when his right hand fiddled with a jam. His breath synced to a metronome of thought. In, aim, fire, move. The wound at his ear throbbed. The taste of blood stayed with him like a shadow. He was, at every point, exquisitely mortal. He bled. He tired. He had no superhuman armor. He simply had an accumulation of small, exact decisions, each one bought with grit, and a kind of stubbornness that had nothing to do with courage as spectacle, and everything to do with the refusal to be the weaker choice. When a Japanese officer launched a feint aimed to draw his fire and expose his position, McKenna did something that would later puzzle analysts. He used that feint to bait a larger mistake. He let a small group close in the expectation of drawing him out, then slammed them with focused bursts and a grenade thrown into their center. The detonation broke their cohesion. He surged through the gap to interrupt their second line of approach. Tactically, it was improvisation with the logic of a hunter. Offer a small, visible meal to a pack, and then take the path that leads them into a trap. The physical exhaustion only made his decisions faster. He had no time to sit and plan. Strategy had been reduced to decision nodes on the ground. Each node was binary. Each one had a cost. He accepted the cost without measured rhetoric. At about 25 minutes in, a sniper from higher ground started to pick off a few men who had lingered in semi-exposed positions. McKenna altered his pattern again. He quit the pit periodically to draw fire and reveal angles. He moved, slower now, more practiced in the economy of motion. He set up short crossfires to deny the high ground a clean shot. His mind cataloged the enemy's rhythm and began to predict the next move. A flanking effort would come through a low ravine. A mortar team would try to adjust fire to bracket the pit more accurately. A small squad would attempt a close assault once the machine gun was reset. He had 3 crucial constraints: dwindling ammunition, rising fatigue, and the uncooperative silence of the captured machine gun. Each one could have been terminal in its own way. He addressed them with the equipment at hand: stolen belts, seized grenades, and sheer will. This is where the narrative often turns mythic, where accounts condense into a single heroic line. But the truth is granular and dirty. The heroism was not a grand, clean arc, but an accumulation of small acts: charging a man with a bayonet to prevent him from setting a weapon, ramming a rifle butt into a jaw to stop a pistol from firing, shoving a fallen comrade behind a berm and refusing to accept the loss of that breathing body. He knew, somewhere distant and ridiculous, that a reaction force might come. He knew that supporting arms could be called in. He also knew that hope could not be banked upon. The immediate present was the only ledger that mattered. At roughly the half-hour mark, the intensity of incoming fire had not abated. If anything, it had focused. The enemy had reorganized. They brought forward fresh men. They tried to use a pair of light mortars to riddle the slope. Small shock teams multiplied like a bad rumor. He answered with a persistent, punishing rhythm. He placed himself where the enemy least expected, and when they adjusted, he was already gone. There was a point where the sheer physical weight of what he had done tugged at his clarity. He stepped into a shallow depression, took stock, and felt the cumulative torque of adrenaline and fear. His hands were raw. The ring in his ear had not stopped. He could taste nothing but salt and iron. He had killed to stay alive, and the fact of that action sat with him in the same place where, before the war, he had learned to read the signs of deer in the underbrush. The attack did not end. It would continue. Reinforcements were being organized. The valley still smoked. Men yelled. The day claimed the sky. But for the time being, which stretched by then into its own geography, he kept the slope. He held the arc of the company's defense with the battered tools of a private soldier, a jammed machine gun, an M1 rifle, scavenged ammo, and a stubborn unwillingness to yield ground. As the 29th minute bled into the 30th, his breathing told him the tale of what lay ahead. He was not finished, but the next phase of the fight would demand something different. A move to grind down the mortar crews, a decision to charge and disrupt a flanking column, and the continued hope that the company's rear would find a way to send help. He gathered the last of the rounds he could find, wiped the blood at his mouth with the heel of his hand, and listened for the subtle change in the enemy's rhythm, ever searching for the next weak seam to pry open. The ridge remained a chessboard of small victories and fresh threats. He prepared for the moment when he would have to make his next choice. If you want more forgotten WPower's stories like this one, hit like and subscribe. There are more to come. He rode the 31st minute on a thread of instinct. The enemy's pattern had become predictable enough to be dangerous. Successive shock teams, mortars correcting in smaller arcs, light automatic weapons trying to sweep known lanes. McKenna answered each with the simplest rule of survival he had ever learned in the woods: deny the enemy comfortable angles. At one point he saw the mortar crews, 2 men working a light tube set in a hollow behind a low-rise, their faces just visible as they adjusted the charge. Mortar fire had been the most indiscriminate thing that morning, arching, anonymous, deadly in its random law. McKenna crawled low, toward a berm where rock and scrap gave him a fraction of concealment. He set his aim on the faint outline of the men and fired short, controlled bursts into the slope. He then lobbed a grenade, precise and cruel in its economy. It did not so much annihilate as scatter, shut down the device, and force hands to clutch wounds instead of rounds. With the mortar crews disrupted, he raced down the slope, collapsing into positions the men had abandoned. He could see the small geometries of the fight now, where dead clustered, where men still breathed, where wounded groaned, and where a stomach of soldiers had been thrown into panic. Every movement cost him. Each burst of speed sent a dull pain through his body, a throb in the ear that had been nicked, a fresh sting every time a piece of shrapnel or grit dug at his skin. But each movement also bought seconds for someone else. He moved because the simple arithmetic of survival for the company required it. He committed a small, brutal calculus: neutralize the mortars or allow the slope to be raked to pieces. He chose to take the risk. Sprinting from cover, he forced himself over the last rise and into the empty space where the crews had been moments before. He hunted them down in the thin, raw light. When he found them, they were disordered, shaken, and unable to bring accurate correction to bear. He fired until they no longer moved. He returned to the pit, stomach hollow with exhaustion, and something that was not victory so much as the immediate relief of a threat removed. Around 33 minutes, the assault began to lose its shape. The enemy had used up much of their coordination in successive waves. The men who remained were smaller teams, frantic attempts to find a gap in a defense that had proven stubborn. McKenna's silhouette remained a problem for them. Their advances still came. Wilting lines, men who still moved through the smoke and dust, determined enough to risk death for the prize of the ridge. But their cohesion wavered. So did his. His hands shook with fatigue. The jammed machine gun, silent at the start, had been reset once, briefly, only to lock again. He had come to accept that its silence was a leverage he could use in a strange way. The enemy wanted it, and their need to prise it back into functioning form drew them into concentrated risk. He used that expectation as bait. He would create an opening small enough to be tempting, then collapse it with decisive violence. The technique was not heroic in cinematic terms. It was cruelly practical. Inspired by a scant, dangerous notion that mobility and unpredictability could be as destructive as firepower, he conducted brief raids down the slope, 20 or 30 yards of exposed ground, forcing enemy teams to break and reform. Those surges were costly. Each one drew return fire. Each one cost energy that continued to accumulate as an interest-bearing debt inside his body. But he got results. Men fell, others hesitated, and the attackers lost their edge. As the clock crept toward 35 minutes, the company's rear elements finally began to close the distance. They squeezed through the ridge lines and shell holes, coordinated by officers who had at last ordered a concentrated counterthrust. Support that had been stuck in the bad geometry of the approaches found their way forward, in spite of the mortars and the intermittent machine gun fire. The sound of friendly boots on the path to the ridge had a weight all its own. It meant relief, reinforcement, and an eventual end to the choices that McKenna had been forced to make alone. His last-minute act was almost an afterthought of survival and denial. A squad tried one final close attack, a last attempt to climb into the gun arc and turn the position. He met them with a compact, furious burst of fire, then charged. He closed distance like a man who had already accepted the most immediate terms of carnage and wanted only to prevent another flanking man from pointing a weapon into the tents where his sleeping comrades lay. He shoved, struck, and pushed until the last attackers lost their nerve and slumped, which is to say they stopped fighting either because they were down or because retreat became the only option. When the 36th minute marked its presence, the shape of the morning changed. Reinforcements smashed into the attackers' flank. The Japanese units, subjected now to coordinated counterfire and threatened with encirclement, began to withdraw. Mortars that had been adjusting for point targets now glanced into ragged, disorganized earth that told of an attack losing steam. The ridge held. There was no cinematic silence at the end, only a sudden change in the texture of noise. The fighting didn't stop so much as shift. Men continued to stumble and move and render aid. Those who could still fight helped drag the wounded to places where medics could reach them. Those who could not lay where they had fallen. The immediate business of the battle reconstituted into the slower, colder business of aftermath. Reinforcements poured in, then medical personnel, then officers with clipboards who traced the morning's geometry with quick, tight notations. The company's commander surveyed the ridge and tried to make sense of the ragged map. Who had held where? Who had died where? Which sectors had been decisive? Investigators came. They counted bodies and mapped shell craters and the places where spent brass littered the ground. They interviewed survivors, sometimes right where they had fought, sometimes later in quieter tents where bandages and exhaustion made stories into staccato fragments. Their conclusion, in formal military language, was a striking one. The pattern of enemy dead clustered in a way that pointed to sustained, concentrated defense anchored at the machine gun pit and the slope around it. Investigators formally attributed 40 confirmed enemy killed to McKenna's actions during that engagement. The number would be entered into reports, annotated in the registries of after-action accounts, and used as the basis for a recommendation for the Medal of Honor. Public memory and small-town retellings would sometimes round the figure to 41. The title used in this video echoes that rounded count as a narrative hook. The documentary record kept the investigators' tally clear. 40 confirmed. The Medal of Honor recommendation folder moved through channels. It was not an instantaneous thing. Witness statements were compiled. Maps were attached. The logistics of confirming the intensity and singularity of the action were painstaking. Commanders wrote that the action had saved the outpost from being overrun. Staff officers added the necessary bureaucratic language about conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. The recommendation was approved. On January 23, 1946, McKenna was officially awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation that accompanied the award did not make a man out of myth. It made a record of facts, dates, places, actions. It did not attend to the small wildness of the man who had fought, the raw fatigue, or the later posture of silence. The medal recognized a particular sequence of choices and their strategic effect. A private soldier who, under heavy assault and with a severe wound, held a crucial position and prevented an enemy force from overrunning his company. He came home not as a parade of brass and television cameras. Those were rarities in a time when the news could be a grainy photograph or a printed dispatch, but in a quieter, more private way. The journey from wartime to civilian life was not an easy seam to stitch. He returned to Georgia to a landscape that seemed unchanged in many optical ways, but which had been altered in social texture. Fields had been let fallow, and local men who had shared his childhood had been missing for months or years. He took to work with a restrained economy of words. He kept the medal in a drawer rather than on a chest. He accepted congratulations with a grunt. The town did not understand exactly how to receive the gravity of what he had done. He did not push them to understand. The psychological wounds, less visible than the cut to his ear, proved stubborn. He had survived a single fierce morning, only to find that some part of him had stayed on that ridge. He woke sometimes in cold panic, an echo of the tent ripping, the flash of blade, the ricochet of shells. The sharpness of the ring in his ear remained a constant companion. He had nightmares in which the landscape of his youth folded into a battlefield. He drank quietly sometimes, the way men in that era often did when sleep was a scarce commodity, and confession was rarer still. He sought no therapy. The vocabulary for post-combat trauma had not yet entered common use. He called it simply being unable to turn the mind off. He avoided public spectacle. When small ceremonies or parades were offered, he demurred. The Medal of Honor, which in other hands could be a permanent role, became in his case a heavy object meant for storage. He did not want the medal to be the thing people saw when they looked at him. He wanted work to be the way people recognized him, not an award. Friends in the town would later joke that the hero in their midst asked for the least possible fuss. Years later, a historian's curiosity and a local campaign would bring his actions back into public conversation. Veterans groups and local officials examined records, talked to surviving members of the unit, and aggregated the paperwork the Army had produced during and after the action. A small movement to honor him gathered steam, not because he had sought it, but because others believed memory deserved to be anchored in place. In 2017, long after the war, the state designated a portion of highway to bear his name. A plaque was placed by the road, simple and direct, stating his name and the date of the action near Dingalan Bay on Luzon. The dedication ceremony was quiet, attended by a mix of surviving kin, local officials, and a handful of veterans. McKenna did not attend. He was no longer amenable to public displays of a war he still carried inside him. He died as many veterans do, quietly, surrounded by neighbors who knew him as a man who could fix a fence, mend a roof, and sometimes tell a terse story about the war without offering the parts of it that still burned. After his death, people rediscovered the drawer and the medal inside. They read the citation and the patchwork of reports that had sat in dusty boxes for decades. People spoke of him as a hero, yes, but also as a man who had paid a price few could measure. The material facts of that morning, May 11, 1945, 4:47 a.m. Company A, 123rd Infantry Regiment, 33rd Infantry Division. The tent slash and near amputation of his right ear. The jammed machine gun, 36 minutes of continuous intense defense, remain as the ledger of what happened. Those facts speak to a kind of ethical complexity that history must hold. A private soldier who used the brutal instruments of war to prevent a greater slaughter. A community that honored him in official ways, even as he sought a life without spectacle. Official counts that recorded 40 confirmed enemy killed as attributable to his actions, while public memory sometimes rounded or retold the number as 41. There is a moral texture to the story that refracts different ways. On one level, it is a tactical study in improvisation and fieldcraft, the way a hunter's instincts, honed in peacetime, translate into the savage logistics of combat. Conservation of ammunition, control of angles, use of terrain, improvisation with captured equipment. On another level, it is an intimate portrayal of what heroism costs, A man who returned home carrying a drawer of metal and a pocket of memories that would not be emptied. The paradox is sharp. A single morning in the Philippines prevented the collapse of an outpost and the slaughter of sleeping comrades. That morning also embedded in McKenna a trauma he would carry to his grave, a silence that no decoration could fill. Medals recognize acts. They do not repair nights. When modern historians piece the event together, they point to something that can be missed in the fervor of retelling. McKenna was not myth. He was wounded, tired, driven by the immediate mechanics of survival, and by a stubborn refusal to surrender ground that he knew would otherwise invite worse bloodletting. The mechanics of his actions, charging, scavenging ammunition, disabling weapons, mixing movement with fire, are teachable and terrifying in equal measure. They tell young soldiers and historians and civilians how small, precise choices can change the outcome of a fight. Memory, too, is taught. The highway sign, the medal in a drawer, the faded photograph in a local paper, they form different registers of remembrance. The highway sign preserves a name in stone. The medal sits as a private memory object. The report in an archive preserves the bureaucratic accounting of death and survival. None of them, alone, tell the whole human truth. But together, they do what memory must. They resist oblivion. The soldiers who faced McKenna on that slope were, in equal measure, trained combatants following orders, moved by their own loyalties and pressures. The narrative does not treat them as faceless or evil. It treats them as the other half of what war makes of humankind. Men given the logic of mission that can only be carried out through violence. Respect for their humanity does not dilute the recognition of the cold, hard fact that the morning would have been worse for McKenna's company had he not held the slope. In the end, the story leaves a quiet ache. It asks what we do with heroism in a country that both honors and expects its veterans to move on. It asks how small towns and families accept men back who have been altered beyond the reach of the words we teach children. It asks us to remember the mechanics of courage, the tedium, the improvisation, the exhaustion, alongside the official citations and the plaques. McKenna's life after the war was a study in reticence. He did not ask to be a symbol. He did not even allow the small public prizes that might have followed to penetrate the long private intimacies of his days. What he left behind was a record that others would interpret. A Medal of Honor in a drawer, after-action reports in an archive, a highway named decades later, a set of numbers, 40 confirmed kills, recorded by investigators, 41 as a popularized figure that became shorthand in the public imagination. The human facts matter most. A 24-year-old from Georgia, a tent cut in the pre-dawn, a saucy abrupt swing of an M1 butt, 36 minutes of relentless tactical defense, the slow arrival of reinforcements, the painstaking verification by investigators, the award of the Medal of Honor on January 23, 1946, a lifetime of quiet, inward battle, a highway that finally bore his name in 2017. We close on that image, the small plaque by the roadside, the quiet man who never sought more than a place to work and a place to sleep, and the road itself, carrying travelers who may never know the exact story, but who will, by passing the name, be nudged into memory. Memory is a fragile thing. It requires not only ceremonies, but also the willingness of a community to keep telling, to pass along facts, and to hold the complexity of the human being behind them. If this story moved you, like and subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Share it with someone who values the quiet, costly bravery that so often leaves a man silent for the rest of his life.